Megan and I are exploring the TV series Foxfire in the season of Because That's What Heroes Do. Today, episode 3, Bushwhacked. Hello, everyone. Tom Fox and Megan Dougherty back for the award-winning Because That's What Heroes Do. We have taken a little bit of a side tour to go to Firefly. And so we're in the third episode, Bushwhacked. Megan, I found this episode very disturbing. How about you?
It's an extremely disturbing episode, and also I think a really important one in terms of the world building for this universe. You're the newbie to this franchise. Tell me, what were your impressions? You found it intense, disturbing. What about it?
We are watching a television show from the mid-aughts, and it struck me that if we were watching this on Netflix or Amazon Prime, Apple, maybe even Disney, it would have been extraordinarily more intense because this was network TV, and it was pretty intense as it was. So frankly, I was glad this wasn't produced in 2018, 2019, 2020, because I'm sure I would have seen things that I would have dreamed about, which would have not have been fun. I guess the second episode, but maybe even the first one, we were introduced to the Reavers, and they clearly created terror for the crew of the Serenity. And now we know why. And they torture, they are cannibals, they are incredibly gruesome in what they do to their not human captives, human victims. And I'm certainly used to seeing people tortured and strung up. I rarely see people gutted, eaten, disemboweled, and then strung up because there was no blood on the floor. So the blood was obviously drained from them.
Oh, that's a good point.
And
I hadn't
if
even thought about that.
Not that I'm not a fan of vampires, but they were actually taking the blood out too and drinking it. So it was about as gruesome a torture, disemboweling scene as probably could have had. And then it turns out there's one survivor. And it's not clear immediately the implication of him being that survivor, but it becomes clear throughout this episode. And that implication is he survived intentionally by the Reavers so that he would see what they were doing. And at first I thought they had left him alive, as you often see in last stand battles or scenes where some group of people is wiped out. There's one left intentionally to tell the story. That's not why he was left alive, although maybe that was part of it. He was left alive to become one of them. And I didn't quite understand the psychology, but the psychology of the show was that to deal with what he saw, he was basically going to turn into one of the Reavers. Mm-hmm. And it started with not self-abuse, but literally self-torture, because he cuts his tongue in half, and then he disfigures his face, and then he puts metal rods and bars through his body. And I don't mean in a cosmetic way.
This is not happening in a nice, sterile tattoo parlor. This is.
No. And the implications of that to me were truly terrifying. And now I see why the crew of the Serenity was so terrified at the thought of Reavers. Because fortunately, in a scene we don't see, he is being held in captivity, restrained, and breaks free and wipes out a medical unit on his own. So that was pretty gruesome and pretty graphic. All of this is around the Alliance having boarded the Serenity. They've come up, found them on routine patrol. They board them. They find out about the sister and brother. They're held incommunicado. They believe, the Alliance believes that the Serenity has killed the members of the cruiser that the Reavers attacked. And then it turns out that Captain Mal is able to convince him what has happened, and he saves the life of the Alliance commander, and they let him go with only confiscating his stolen goods. I don't want to say all's well that ends well, because this did not end well for anyone involved. But the horror and the terror was communicated in a way. For me, it's always more effective when I don't see it. And whatever it is, whether it's sex, love, torture, misogyny, whatever it is, if it's hinted at, for me, it's always more powerful. And this was incredibly powerful, except for one brief scene where they showed his disfigured face, which he had done to himself. We never saw the Reavers. We had a brief scene of the victims. And so a pretty terrifying show, and putting a very different spin on, as you said, building out the backstory of the franchise.
I've noticed, picked up on a lot of the same things. That quotation particularly about why humans who have been attacked or preyed upon by the Reavers then become them. It was the only way to deal with it is to become it. And I thought that was a really interesting idea and way to phrase it. And I guess within the context of the universe and the context of this particular ship that was traveling too, because it was mentioned at the beginning of the episode that this was not a deep space ship. This was a short range, small cruiser that was never meant to go far to the outer side of the galaxy, and it's stuffed with these families who are going to settle. Maybe not even knowing what kind of a threat Reavers might be, because another really interesting point I thought was that the main Alliance captain didn't really believe that Reavers could be a thing that he might actually encounter. His first tour out in this outer side of the world, or outer side of the universe. So that was really interesting how that all came together, and he was sharply awoken to the reality of the situation.
He was a complete by-the-book guy, and he made that clear several times. And once again, this was not said directly and certainly said by implication, but as you noted, he's got a lot to learn. And there's going to be rules that may not be followed to the letter of the law. There may be situations where he has to take actions that are a little bit different than what his training may have suggested. You probably rarely take a prisoner in handcuffs onto a ship where you think they're alien beings and then have them that person in handcuffs lead the attack. I really like the continued emphasis that we really are on the frontier. And it really is the Wild West. It's the Wild West on planets, it's the Wild West on ships, and it's the Wild West in space. And that makes, of course, for delicious storytelling possibilities, even if they are a little dark.
Even that settler ship that had been attacked by the Reavers, it was exactly like a wagon train would have been set up. You get a bunch of people together, you get everything that you own, you sell everything you can't take with you, put it into one little batch, and you just go until you can't go anymore. I thought it was a really interesting way of kind of imagining what the mindset is of being willing or feeling that you need to do that to take the next step in your life. I think is really interesting.
Is that part of the tradition of Canadian history? Did you have wagon trains going west across Canada?
I'm not sure about wagon trains specifically. I think that might have been a more United States thing. When we were learning about it in school, it was always about the fur trapping and the hunting parties going west. It was the Hudson's Bay Company. But presumably people did go out and settle as soon as it was possible.
How did they get people to the prairie provinces and then all the way over to British Columbia, where they had to have been families to settle that? Does Canada have a tradition around that?
The settling tradition, you always hear about it by rail. So maybe they built out the railway at the same time. Great Canadian Rail.
Because the wagon train tradition is obviously well known in the United States, and indeed Star Trek was wagon train to the skies. But
I was brought up on Little House on the Prairie.
There you go. The thought of him, there was a lengthy description of the survivor being forced to watch. And that, for me, brought up Alex, the Droog in A Clockwork Orange.
Oh, yeah.
Had his eyelids opened and pried opened so that he was forced to watch violence, having given medicine to make him ill when he started to engage in violence. I don't know if they had one of those kinds of contraptions or not, but the thought of having to watch, including your loved ones, that happened to, is pretty gruesome. So let me explore with you, because the psychology part, I still just didn't understand. And is there some basis in literature or film or pop culture or something that would suggest the only way to deal with something so terrible is to become that thing?
Specifically, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I know it comes up a lot, I think, historically, especially that what you get desensitized to becomes normal. And getting to see atrocities committing all the time makes it seem like a much more normal thing to be near or to even participate in. Now I'm trying to think if there are specific ones that are just like that. If you look at it, you must become it.
We use the phrase broken children become broken parents, but that's a generation to develop from a child to a parent. But this was much quicker. But I couldn't think of another example of that.
maybe there's some possible similarities in some of the Greek folk or the Greek mythology. So I'm thinking of Medusa the Gorgon, and you don't become a Gorgon by looking at Medusa. It does permanently change your state. And kind of similar with Narcissus, the looking causing the impact of harm or permanent change. That would be interesting to explore more.
One thing that I saw in a couple of, or at least one of the articles I read, raised some questions about the brother and sister, the Tams, and why wasn't there a more strident red notice or an information to say, stop these people at all cost? Because there was a BOLO or whatever Alliance Police would call it, but it was only, oh yeah, detain these people. I was a little surprised there was not something more definitive or more stronger, something that would tell the Alliance ship captain, hey, you need to get these people and you need to call us now.
I think the answer was it's all classified. They're not sharing the information, and it makes me think that they don't want it too well known that this has happened and that this has occurred. Because Simon Tam also, they're from a wealthy, influential family on a central planet. It would have been fairly easy to get their picture and their name flashing on every bar in the whole system, but they didn't want to do that. So I think they're trying to keep it on the down low without any spoilers.
Well, that was a mistake certainly this time. Let's see, there was one other.
I don't know what.
We didn't mention the booby trap.
The booby trap. Oh. Yeah, because there's the booby trap it's what the Reavers left on the settler cruise ship that they had ravaged, that would hook into the systems of whatever ship came to scavenge it. They knew that they had left someone. They knew someone was coming. I think this was a recruitment drive, basically, in their horrifying fashion. But I think they were planting a little seed that would grow into another Reaver ship. Maybe that's how they grow their population. And
Kaylee, our engineer by Intuit, de-arms it or deactivates it. Now that we've done this podcast, I think this is as gruesome an episode as when we started. Maybe even more so because I've talked to you about it. Any final thoughts?
One, and on a slightly lighter note, I thought there was some really great character building that happened, especially around the interrogation. I love that scene. It's one of my favorite parts of the episode, and everyone is really getting to demonstrate their personality under pressure when being interrogated by the Alliance. And my particular favorite was about sweet little Kaylee, who just could not get over her disgust at Serenity being called junk. Absolutely not standing for it. Loved that about her, and everything Wash and Zoe said about each other to the interrogator was just hilarious.
You have to recall in The Trouble with Tribbles, Mr. Scott took personal insults about Captain Kirk, but when they called the Enterprise garbage, he stood up and struck the Klingon. So do not criticize an engineer about her ship. They are very protective.
Yeah, I thought that was charming. And the little fake out right there when the captain was chatting with Inara, and then he switched to, do you love him? And then cutting back to Zoe, brilliant fake out. I thought that was excellently done.
I like Jane in the interviews. He was a lot more sardonic than I had seen him. And he's got a brain up there. He just doesn't choose to use it, or at least vocalize it as often as perhaps he could.
Yeah, I loved the choice of him sitting there stoically just staring back at the interrogator, where the soldiers are searching his little apartment, his quarters, for all the weapons, finding the wall of guns. It was just perfectly done. So good.
We found an illegal knife in your quarters. Really? Yeah.
Just the one?
Okay. Just the one. That, I think, ends this episode, and I'm Tom Fox.
I'm Megan Dougherty. See you next time.
This is Tom Fox again. I hope you'll join us for our next episode where we take up Shindig. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I hope you will subscribe, rate, and review wherever great podcasts are listened to. The podcast, Because That's What Heroes Do, is now the award-winning podcast, Because That's What Heroes Do, and is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network.